Julia Stephanides, a labor and employment lawyer who has represented employees in discrimination, harassment, disability, equal pay, and protected leave cases. She's going to talk to us today about what our rights are as people with mental illness in the workplace. I want to remind our audience that this is a live stream, so pop your questions for Julia into the comment box at any time, and they might just be answered during the podcast. But before we get to Julia, I just want to remind people that mental health is very important. We're actually here to discuss specifically mental illness in the workplace, and these are not the same thing. 20% of people have a diagnosable mental illness, but everybody, 100% of people have mental health. And we aim to shine the light on the 20% of people who actually have mental illness. Now, one quick note about our programming today. Julia is extremely knowledgeable and we are honored that she is here to help, but keep in mind that all situations are unique and she can only give us general information. For specific information on your situation, you may have to contact a lawyer personally. Hi, Julia. Welcome to Snap Out of It.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, thank you for being here. We are so glad to hear about this really important topic. So tell me a little bit about yourself.
Share.
Great. Oh. That's okay.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm just so excited. I'm ready to go. Your question was to talk a little bit about myself.
Yes.
I can certainly do that. So you said you pronounced my last name so beautifully. I just wanted to give you kudos for that because that never happens. But yeah, you'd shared I'm a labor and employment attorney. I've spent most of my career representing workers rather than companies. I graduated from Berkeley Law and I am licensed to practice in California. So that's just, general disclaimer that none of the things that I'm saying constitute legal advice. And, if you do have specific legal questions, make sure to talk to an employment lawyer in your state. In addition to being a lawyer, I have also been dealing with some chronic illnesses for the last 5 to 7 years. It's gotten particularly bad, in the last 3 years. I've had this health journey of my own, and I've become really passionate about things that I didn't used to know anything about, like polyvagal theory, the nervous system, functional medicine, nutrition, things like that. I've always loved food and cooking, and it's been really fun to start learning how to make some of my favorite recipes a little bit healthier. But I've also become passionate about, mental health and mental illness. Not passionate about people having mental illness, but, helping, people try to feel better and also to get, the support that they need at work and beyond. So I'm very excited to chat with you guys.
Well, thank you so much. So you've mentioned that you've had your own journey with chronic illness. So what exactly have your experiences with the healthcare system been like?
Well, I want to say I'm certainly grateful for some of the excellent doctors that I've seen, but I think like many people with chronic illness, I've had a really tough time in the conventional medical system. And being someone who's very into I'm highly educated, very generally trusting of our institutions and establishments here in the United States, and it was very disillusioning for me to realize that there's just a lack of understanding of what causes chronic illness and how to treat it in the Western, conventional medical model. So when my symptoms started, they were pretty vague. It was like dizziness, lightheadedness, chronic fatigue, ear ringing, things like that. And my doctors just, I could tell they almost seemed annoyed by me because all my testing came back normal.
Yeah.
And then they would literally say things like, your labs look great news. You're in great health. So you're good. And I was like, what do you mean I'm good? I'm having all these new symptoms that I've never had before and I can barely function. Like, I don't know if I'm good. And so then they very quickly, passed me to a psychiatrist, said this is all just stress. And I think that's something they often do when they don't know what's going on, particularly with women.
Yes.
I was finally diagnosed with chronic vestibular migraines. And even then, I was so grateful to get a diagnosis. But, I said, that's so odd. I've never had headaches or migraines before. So I wonder what's causing this. Like, something must be going on. And the migraine specialist just sort of like cocked his head to the side and chuckled. And he was like, we don't know. Lots of things. We don't look at causes. We just we'll just help you treat them. And he kind of was like, here's a list of medications you can try. And I was just surprised, I was surprised. And I think that is kind of the medical model is often like with chronic illness, we're not even going to try to identify what's going on. We're just going to help you medicate it. And unfortunately, I don't tolerate medication well. None of the medications were helpful for me. So I started down a road of like looking for answers elsewhere because I was unfortunately, not getting what I needed there. So that's where I kind of got more interested in functional medicine and somatic therapy and things like that. And I just think there's a lack of understanding of the nature of chronic illness and how to interact with chronic illness patients in a way that's not dismissive and that doesn't add more trauma to the experience, and in a way that actually is effectively treating, what's going on with them. So I think this is a major gap in medical knowledge and understanding, and I hope that it's going to be addressed in the future. But to answer your question, it was long-winded, but it didn't drive my specialization choice, actually. Because I was interested in labor and employment law long before I started having health issues.
Okay.
I just think this area of law is really interesting, and I've always cared about workers' rights and advocating for people, particularly people who are oppressed by our social systems. So representing workers just seemed like a natural fit, and then it ended up kind of dovetailing that, some of the work I did was for people who had disabilities in the workplace.
Yeah, well, thank you. I thank you for being so open about your own personal journey. I know that many people with mental illness would have a parallel experience as one with a different kind of chronic illness, right? I call mental illness a chronic illness. It is for many of us, and certainly our experiences often are very similar to what you described. So, switching gears just slightly here, what is the one thing that people with mental illness don't know about their rights in the workplace?
Oh, I mean, there's probably a lot of things,
Yeah.
and I guess that's kind of the thing. I think there's a lot of people who don't even realize that there are laws that protect them. They think that their condition maybe isn't severe enough, or they don't even know the laws, and they don't realize that they're entitled to certain protections. And I can relate to that because as someone struggling with these migraines for a very long time, even though I was practicing employment law, it didn't even occur to me that I would be entitled to a medical leave or that I would be considered a person with a disability under the law. And I just sort of, struggled through it and was ultimately like, I had a supervisor suggest that I go on medical leave. And I was like, oh, I can do that. But I think that people don't realize that they're entitled to these protections, and maybe they don't think that their condition counts as a disability, or they don't think it's severe enough to be considered a disability.
Yeah, so one of the things that I found out where I was working in the office last time was that mental illness could be considered a disability. I actually never really thought about that, either in my case or anyone else's. But can you tell us what the definition of disability is and what mental illnesses might fall into that category?
Yes, well, that's a big question, so bear with a long answer, but the laws that protect people with disabilities in the United States vary by state. There is a federal law called the Americans with Disabilities Act, and I'll refer to that as the ADA. And this applies to companies with 15 or more employees, including state and local governments. So if you went to work for an exciting new startup and you're one of the first employees, you're likely not going to be protected by the ADA. It also doesn't cover independent contractors. So, there's been a lot of talk lately about the gig economy and people having more freedom. One of the drawbacks to that is that if you're an independent contractor, you lose almost every protection of employment law. So there are definitely benefits to being like a W-2 employee because you're protected by these employment laws, and that includes the ADA. So some states do have different minimums. So the Fair Employment and Housing Act in California applies to employers with 5 or more employees. So you would want to make sure to check the disability discrimination laws in your state. You can just Google this, and often you'll come up with what you need. But just know that the ADA is the minimum standard for all states. And so with that said, the definition under the ADA says that a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity is disabled and therefore protected. So, major life activities include things like seeing, sleeping, learning, hearing, breathing, thinking, speaking, concentrating, walking, communicating, caring for oneself. So it's a pretty broad definition, in my opinion, and it can cover a lot more than you think. There's not a list of conditions that are considered disabilities under the ADA. It's sort of a case by case determination, but generally things like blindness, deafness, or paralysis are physical disabilities, but then the definition is much broader. So it can include conditions like depression, PTSD, anxiety, bipolar disorder, and things like fibromyalgia, migraines,
Right.
as long as they're severe enough. So, mental health issues are often considered disabilities.
Yeah, and I think what you said there actually is really critical, which is severity, right? So you might have a mental illness and it might not be very severe, in which case it's not a disability, or you might have a mental illness that is very severe, in which case it may be considered a disability. And so severity might be the key to think about when you think about mental illness rather than specific illnesses.
Yeah, I think that's right because I think what you want to look at is whether or not it falls within that definition. So, do you have a mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity for you? So, do you have a mental impairment that substantially limits your ability to think, speak,
Right.
concentrate? A lot of mental, a lot of anxiety can definitely impair your concentration and your
Yes.
focus. Depression can majorly affect your sleeping, your communication with others, So a lot of these things do, fall within that.
And I think one thing that you haven't mentioned, but that I just want to add, is that if it becomes an issue getting disability, try to have your doctor document these things for you. So if you're having trouble sleeping, try to make sure that's in your medical records. If you're having trouble communicating, that's something that needs to be in your medical records because that's your backup, right? Your doctor is your backup. You can claim that you're having trouble, but it's good when it's documented. Would you agree with
Yes.
that?
I
Yes.
mean, I think that getting your doctor's support is extremely important. So this is different than like going on disability, and that we'll
Right.
talk about that later. But if you want to, yeah, be protected in the sense that if your employer fires you or something and you think it's related to your mental health issues, or if they refuse to give you a reasonable accommodation, yes, it's great to have support whatever you're claiming at work. And just generally, that's really good practice to have all of this documented. So, that's a big part of why, like, even though I don't feel that I'm necessarily getting a lot out of some of my conventional doctors, I do have like a neurologist who I love.
Right.
But I do continue to see them and document my progress with them and tell them what my symptoms are and what, I'm having trouble at work. I'm having,
Right.
I'm not able to concentrate long enough to write a brief because I want to make sure there's a record of that in case I
Right.
ever do need to go on long-term disability or something like that. So I think that was a really good point. And I do just, Natasha, can I also just say what the protections are for people who have these
Yeah.
disabilities under the law?
Please go ahead.
So the ADA basically says that if you have a disability and you can perform your basic job duties, your employer can't harass, demote, or fire you, or pay you less, or basically just can't treat you poorly because of your disability. They also can't reject a job applicant because of a disability. So that's kind of the protection there. And, it's just good to know that even though mental illness can be kind of stigmatized, it's really not something that a job is supposed to use against you.
So, if you did have, if you decided that your mental illness qualified as a disability, how would you actually tell your employer, and what specifics do you actually have to tell them?
Well, that's a tough question because you don't have to disclose it at all. Like this is really a case by case analysis for you, and it really depends on your level of trust in the organization and your relationship with your supervisors. There's always kind of a risk benefit analysis because if you decide to disclose that you have a mental health condition in the workplace, unfortunately, there are some people who still have, biases against people with well, with mental health conditions and with, physical chronic health conditions and may think, oh, will this person really be able to get the job done? Are they going to be
Yes.
erratic or unreliable? And, that's always a risk. And I think it's, it's certainly something you're going to want to disclose if you think you'll need the protections of the law, like if you would like to take a medical leave or if you want to request a reasonable accommodation. But if you have a disability, but you feel that you've been able to do your job and it's not affecting your work, I don't see a need to disclose unless, again, like unless you're close with your colleagues and your supervisors and you want to share. And personally, I think it's really great to do that because I think we need to remove the stigma of this stuff, particularly after, all of this COVID mess. There's a lot more people with mental illness than there were before. And I mean, I think one of the symptoms of long COVID is depression and anxiety.
It is. Yeah.
So, so this is something, it's affecting a lot more people than it used to. And I think we really need to just start talking about it openly. But that said, as someone who cares about employee rights, I don't want you to put your job on the line. And
right,
so use your judgment. I'm close with my supervisors, and I do share about, I have Lyme disease, and I think that's kind of the root cause of a lot of my issues. And I also have mast cell activation syndrome, and I've shared that with my supervisors. I feel that they're understanding, and I also know, I have needed to take medical leave. So I wanted them to understand when I took it that it wasn't coming out of the blue, right?
Right.
But I do think it's just, we can talk more about best practices later, but I think it's really important that you act with integrity with all of this stuff and like navigate your work very skillfully in the way that you're not erratic, you're not dropping the ball on things. If there's an assignment you can't finish because you're not feeling well, that you communicate that, right?
Right.
You want to be seen as reliable and dependable and communicative, and typically in that instance, like if you're doing your job well and you're acting with integrity, my hope would be that the workplace, would welcome whatever health issues you have, as long as it's not like drastically impairing your ability to do your job. Of course, that's not always the case. And sometimes, you just get people who are uncomfortable with it.
So if I were to talk to my supervisor because I have bipolar disorder and it's a disability, do I have to tell my supervisor that I have bipolar disorder, or do I just have to tell them that I have a disability? Like, what specifically do I have to tell them?
So it depends for what purpose you're telling them. If that's the key issue, and
okay,
I think that we're going to talk a bit about reasonable accommodations. If you're requesting a reasonable accommodation, meaning that you need something to change about like your work schedule or your office or something like that, you do need to disclose that you have a disability in order to be considered for a reasonable accommodation.
Yes.
So all you need to disclose is, you have to tell someone who represents your employer that you have a disability, and you don't have to share every detail, but you need to provide enough information to show that you do have a disability and that you need an accommodation. And you don't have to do it in writing, but it is always a good idea to have a paper trail. So it can be helpful. Well, I would start with just saying, for example, I'd say like you have severe anxiety, open office, like where everyone's working together and you can hear everyone's phone calls, say that really triggers you. So
sure. I
would start with just emailing HR or emailing my supervisor and saying, hi, like, I just want to let you know that, I have a disability, and having to work in the open floor plan is really challenging for me, and I'm not able to focus as well. I think if I could get a private office or could get some noise canceling headphones, I think I'd be able to do a much better job and focus better and be more productive. Like looking forward to, talking about options with you. And that should start kind of the interactive process. Then if they want more details, maybe they'll want more details about what your disability is, and you just have to see. I think most employers, smart employers, will just say, okay, let's talk about some options, but they may need more details about what is going on for you so that they know how to accommodate it.
Perfect. So, folks, you are tuned in to Snap Out of It, the Mental Illness in the Workplace podcast, and we are talking to Julia Stephanides, a lawyer with extensive experience in employment law. Now, don't forget, if you have any questions for Julia, please pop them in the comment box, and we may just answer them on air. So, we talked about what a disability actually is, and I believe one of the big advantages of falling into the category of having a disability is, as you said, you can ask for a reasonable accommodation. But the term reasonable accommodation seems really vague to me. Can you explain to us what a reasonable accommodation actually is?
Yeah. Again, so this may vary state by state, but under the federal law, the ADA, a reasonable accommodation is just an adjustment or a modification that's made to your job or to the workplace itself to enable an employee or a job applicant to successfully perform the basic duties of the position. So remember, I had said that you have to be able to perform your basic job duties if you're a person with a disability in order to be protected by the law. So if you can't perform your basic job duties, even with then your employer can fire you or can
Okay.
refuse to hire you. But you do have the right to say, look, I can't do my basic job duties now, but if you provide this reasonable accommodation, then I can. And a reasonable accommodation is basically anything that doesn't cause undue hardship for your employer. And undue hardship is defined as something that requires a lot of significant difficulty or expense to implement. So what we're looking at is, like, I always like to think of it as like just knowing what your needs are and knowing how you best work. So if you need a workplace that is quiet, or you
Right.
like, for me, my environment is very important to me. I'm highly sensitive, and I'm much more productive in a space that does not have fluorescent lights and that is quiet. And I just need that. And because I have documented disabilities, that's something where I could say, hey, I'm going to turn off my lights. Can you please order me a floor lamp? And it's like,
Right.
like a warm colored floor lamp. And that like really impacts my mood and ability to focus. Having a private office is really good for me. So I just think of it as like, if it's something that is extremely expensive and your employer is a nonprofit, probably not going to be considered reasonable. But,
Right.
Courts really do consider it on a case by case basis, and they'll take into account factors like the cost of the accommodation, the resources of the employer, and the impact the accommodation will have on the facility. So if you can be creative about things that would help you at work, the sky is really the limit as long as it's not too expensive or too burdensome.
I know someone that had bipolar disorder who was working in a company that was very large, and what he actually asked for was access to the nursing room that we had in the company, because that room was quiet and small, and he could calm down, and he could actually sort of reduce his anxiety, reduce what was going on in his brain if he could be in a room like that for a short period of time. So
That's
that was
perfect. I
that
love
was an
that.
so that was an accommodation that he asked for that was reasonable, according to him and the employer. So that's just an
And of course
example.
that's reasonable. Like,
Yeah.
there's no cost at all, right?
Right.
He's asking for a new nursing room to be built. Even then, if there's extra space in the office, why not? But that's exactly the kind of creative solution where it's like the employer and the employee can really work together, because it's in the employer's best interests to have you comfortable and supported at work, because you're going to do your best work that way. And so I really think there can be alignment here. It does not have to be like me versus my company. And let's hope you're working for a company that, where people aren't total assholes and where they want to be accommodating folks with different needs. And, I found most of the places I've worked have been very open to like, oh, you have this condition and this is one of, something you need. Great. I think it's just like there's like such an issue, at least in the US, probably elsewhere too, especially with women, about having needs. Like, the fact
Right.
that you have needs is needy or difficult.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
And everyone has this fear. I mean,
Yeah.
I still have this fear that, like, I know my doctors think I am a difficult patient, even though I'm extremely polite
Yeah.
and, a good listener. But I ask questions, I probe, and when they tell me they don't know something, like, I dig deeper. And people don't like that. But it's the same with, like, having needs at work. Everyone wants to be easy, right? Like, I
Right.
keep using quotes because these words, but
Right. Yeah.
everyone wants to be low maintenance and easy. And I really want to see a cultural shift around, like, there's nothing wrong with having needs. We all have needs. Like, PSA, every single person has needs. Some of us just have needs that are different than what the mainstream provides. And we all need to start getting in touch with our needs, emotionally and physically, and speaking our needs. And like, you should be going to a workplace where they're willing to meet your needs, unless your needs are, like we said, extremely expensive for the company or extremely unreasonable. But I know not everyone has the privilege of being really particular about where they work, and some of us just need to keep our paychecks going, and I totally understand that. But if you have the privilege of, you don't like your job has not been kind to you, and they seem to be dismissive of your needs or seem to imply that you're difficult, and you have the privilege of like looking elsewhere, then I would say look elsewhere, because there are companies that know that this is something that they should be doing.
I interviewed an amazing woman CEO named Saskia a few weeks ago, and she was talking about how providing things for her employees, and she certainly went above and beyond what the minimum standards would be, but providing things like this for her employees saved her company money, because she didn't have to have people leave and then actually hire people again. So when you think about, just for a second, if you're difficult, if you're asking for something because you have a need, for example, consider the fact that you're actually saving the company money by getting your work done more efficiently, more effectively, and they don't have to hire for your position again. So consider the fact that you're not actually difficult, you're not actually a detriment to the company, you're actually a help to the company. That was her point, and I think that fits really nicely with what you're saying.
I love that. No, I think that's such a good point, and companies, like if you're working for a big tech company, like I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, a lot of people work for tech companies, and it just makes me laugh when like an individual employee is like, I don't want to be a burden. I'm like, these companies have so much money, and you are going through hell. You're struggling with your health, and you are still showing up and doing your work for this company. Like, the least that they can do is give that back, right? I mean, we live in a society where the balance is really tipped towards corporate power. The companies have the money and the power here. So I'm just so tired of seeing individual people feel like they're burdening these companies when these companies are the ones that are everything out of you and giving oftentimes, not a lot back. And you need to like know your worth and know that you deserve to be supported by the place that you are giving 40 plus hours of your week to.
So folks, this is Snap Out of It, and we are talking to Julia Stephanides, a lawyer who is schooling us on our rights as people with mental illness at work. Pop your questions into the comment box wherever you're watching, and we may just answer them on air. So here's a general question for you. So are people with mental illness entitled to medical leave from work, and is any of this time paid? For paid time off?
Well, like everything else with the law, everyone gets so annoyed with lawyers because this is how we answer questions. It depends.
Right.
But it genuinely does kind of depend on the circumstances. So it depends on whether they're covered by a state law. Like I said, the laws in the United States vary state by state, or whether they're covered by the Federal Family and Medical Leave Act. Did you ask also if it has to be paid?
Yes.
Oh, it's such a depressing question because
sorry.
it's just like the United States, like the protections for workers in this country are so bad compared with other like developed countries. And if you look at like most countries in Europe, for example, like what they offer for maternity leave, it's like, a year, paid maternity leave. I'm like, what? Like, we don't have paid maternity leave in the United States. And so, no. Under the federal law, under the FMLA, there is no requirement for medical leave to be paid. It's absolutely crazy to me, and it's something we all need to be advocating for, is like paid maternity leave, paid medical leave. But luckily, there are ways to fill in the gaps, and I can talk more about like my own experience with medical leave, but basically what happens is that, I'll share more about what entitles you to medical leave, but if it's determined that you have a serious health condition and can go on medical leave, and you take the time off, and a lot of us can't off work without pay. So a lot of companies kind of fill in the gaps where they have short-term disability insurance, and so that will usually be like 60 to 70% of pay. And then also, I think this is changing a lot. I think it's like 7 states, but don't quote me on that. I know California, New York have this. They have short-term disability benefits. And I
Okay.
remember when I went out on medical leave for my migraines, I was like, what am I going to do? Well, like, I am a public interest lawyer. I have
Right.
$200,000 of loans. Like, I am not, people think lawyers are like super rich. And let me tell you,
Right.
some are, some are
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So I was very worried about what was going to happen to my finances, but I also was like, I can't function and I have to take time off. And I didn't really know a lot about disability benefits, but I did apply. My doctor submitted a form for me under the California State Disability Program, and this is another example of where it's very important to have your doctor on board. If you apply for
Right.
disability, they will not grant it unless you have a doctor certification. So yeah, very important to work with a doctor who believes you and believes in
Hmm.
the severity of your condition in case it ever comes to this. So luckily, I was working with a doctor who was willing to certify that I had a disability and who agreed that I needed time off work. And yeah, basically I didn't know what to expect, and it was like a little bit delayed, like it was kind of slow, and I was like eating up all my savings being out for 3 months. And close to the end of my time, I just started getting all these checks from the California EDD, the Employment Development
Wow.
Department, and like $10,000, $12,000,
Okay.
$15,000. And I'm like sobbing. Just like,
Oh.
I just like couldn't believe the state of California was giving me all this money to support myself and to take care of myself. And like, I just felt so grateful to live here and to live in a place where like we treat workers like human beings when they're having a tough time, because it was just such a hard time, and to have the financial stress on top of my physical and mental stress, I felt, I was like, this is why employment laws and employment benefits are so important. And I was able to, like, what happens with California state disability, at least mine, was it wasn't taxed. So even though it was
Ah.
like, yeah, it was like 60% of my full income,
Hmm.
but it wasn't taxed. So
Right.
it was basically exactly my whole income. I used like a
Right.
couple vacation days to make up the difference, but I took 3 months off work without taking a financial hit. And that should be the norm. Like I said,
Right.
we should get
Right.
paid medically, but we don't in this country. So make sure to look into what your state offers. And it's also important, if you have a health condition, to prioritize finding a company that offers some kind of short and long-term disability program in case you live in a state that doesn't offer disability benefits. The majority
Yeah.
of states do not offer them, which
Right.
is, again, the US is like the wild, wild west. People here, it's all about like individualism, taking care of yourself. So there's really not a big safety net. And that's why, like, it's great to live in a state where the mentality is a little bit different.
Yeah, so I guess where you live is so critical in the United States that that's something maybe you should consider when you're moving, when you're doing something. I mean, like you said, if it's the wild, wild west, you want to know what side you're on for certain issues if they're going to really be pertinent to you. Some people aren't going to care about short-term leave, but some people really are going to care about that. So, yeah, thank you for being so clear that it really depends on where you live
And what your company offers. I mean, that's
and what your
another,
company offers. Yeah.
if you live in Texas, but you work for a progressive company and they have great short-term
Yeah.
disability benefits, then you're fine.
So, what exactly should a
Oh,
person do? Oh, go ahead.
no, I'm trying to think back though, because these answers are so long, and I apologize. It's just because the law is so specific.
Yeah.
Did you ask me like? Oh no, no, I don't think you have asked me about the specifics of the FMLA yet.
No, so there's only so much we can do today, but I promise we may have time to get into those details in a little bit, or maybe even a separate episode. But I appreciate all the information that you've given us so far. Thank you. Um, so, what exactly does an employee do if an employer refuses a right that they know is a legal right?
Well, I mean, it depends.
Yeah.
It depends on the circumstances, and it depends on how much you need that right. But I think overall, um, you're gonna want to decide what what matters to you, right? So say you request a reasonable accommodation and they say, no, that's unreasonable.
Right.
So then you have to decide, how important is this to me? How important is this job to me? And how important are my relationships with my supervisors and HR here? And at that point, you're going to, you're either deciding between standing up for yourself, digging in your heels, and challenging it, and possibly, getting a lawyer, or putting your head down and accepting the decision and just trying to get the job done. And I think, or the third option is to leave, like to
Right.
find another job, to say this,
Yeah.
I don't want to work at a place like this. And so, even as a lawyer, I always recommend like an escalation of approaches. If you do decide option one, I want to stand up for myself, then, you do need to know that you're risking tarnishing your relationships there. And hopefully you have one person who can act as a reference there no matter what, or maybe you don't need a reference there. But it's just a practical consideration that it may be awkward, and you have to be comfortable with like, oh, this could get a little awkward. But yeah, I always say the first step, if you don't agree with something the company's doing and you think it might be unlawful, is, you can get a lawyer right away and they can help you out with advocating for yourself. That can be very expensive. I really get a big gap in like affordable legal services for people who aren't facing criminal charges. But
Right.
I would say that, if you want to do it on your own, the next thing to do, if, again, say you're denied a reasonable accommodation, the next thing we would recommend as lawyers is like sending like what we call a demand email. So where you kind of you basically are trying to put the company on notice that you know your rights and you're going to stand up for them, and you know
Right.
the law, right? You know the law, and kind of make them nervous, make them think, oh shit, this person maybe has a lawyer or could be getting a lawyer, and we need to just diffuse the situation and, try to work with them. So you could say in the email, hi HR, I recently received your denial of my request for reasonable accommodation. As stated previously, I have X disability. I'm happy to submit a documentation from my medical provider that, confirms that I have this disability, and under, this state law or the ADA, whichever one you're using, people with disabilities are entitled to reasonable accommodations. What I requested was reasonable because it didn't cause, it didn't cause an undue burden. It wasn't particularly expensive, and you guys have plenty of money. I mean, you'll want to say it differently, but I know the resources of this company are significant, or that could cover this accommodation. And I'm concerned that your denial of my request is a violation of the law. I'm very hopeful that we can reach an amicable resolution on this. Please let me know if you'd like to discuss, or please get back to me by the end of the week to discuss.
Yes.
And I think generally when you say, I'm hoping we can resolve this amicably, that tends to be, you're telling them, look, I'm aware that there are other avenues I can take if we don't resolve this amicably. But you're not having to specifically say, hey, you denied my request, I'm going to sue you.
Right.
You're not. So it's kind of this escalation approach. And then if they if they ignore that, or they say no to that, then you think about, okay, do I want to get a lawyer? Do I want to think about bringing legal action? And that's where and of course that's extremely expensive, extremely stressful. And my goal is to help people not have to do that.
Right.
And to skillfully just navigate these situations so that, they're getting what they need without having to sue anyone.
Well, thank you for laying out exactly what should be in an email like that, because I think that for some people, sitting down and trying to write an email like that is just a huge thing, and they can't even think of what to say to an HR department, right? So thank you so much for outlining that, because I think that's really going to help people know, okay, these are the bullet points I need to have in my email. And like you said, you do want to approach the situation like a problem that you need to solve together, as opposed to a contentious issue, because the last thing you want to do is make an enemy of your employer. Right? And if you choose to sue them, that's a different thing. But while you're working through things, like you said, while you're escalating, you try to make friends with your employer, not enemies.
I agree. And I do think sending an email like that, putting them on notice, it is the first step in things becoming a bit more hostile, just because if what I would recommend you do, and again, this is not formal legal advice. This is what I have done in the past for clients. I don't take new clients right now. I work for a labor union. Like, none of this is legal advice. This is just, my thoughts on what I do in these
Right.
situations now that I have the legal knowledge that I have, is kind of look at the elements of the law. Google the law that applies to you. Look at the elements and apply the facts of your case to those elements. And when you reference the law, they see, oh, this person's informed and they're taking this seriously. They may even send it to their in-house counsel, and say, what do you think of this? Should we? And so at that point, you are raising things up a little bit more.
Yeah.
But sometimes that's what you need to do to get your needs met.
Thank you so much. So I do have a couple of questions that were submitted earlier. A couple of questions came in, so I would like to pose a couple of questions to you. So Jay asks this. I came across an incident recently where someone was experiencing a mental health crisis, and they had posted on LinkedIn a message that clearly expressed that he was at risk of suicide. His employer, which was a healthcare provider, fired him for posting this. I do not believe he disclosed his mental illness to that employer. So the question is, in the US, does an employer have any obligation to consider clear signs of mental illness if it was not disclosed, or even if it was?
Yeah, I mean, that's a weird, I'm surprised to hear that the company did that. That seems stupid to me. And also,
Well,
I'm
yeah.
sad to hear that. That's really sad, and I'm sorry. Um, the whole point is that the company needs to have some notice that you have a mental health issue in order so that they can be held accountable for, if they fire you,
Right,
they could say, oh, well, we fired him because he was a bad employee. We didn't even
right,
know he had a mental health issue. I would
right.
say that the posting on LinkedIn was a disclosure that this person had a mental health
Okay.
condition. And so that I would think that would satisfy the need to provide some notice if the employer saw that and the employer fired him because of that. And if there's some kind of evidence to show that that is why he was fired, and that, that may be hard to show that causal relationship, I would think that would be problematic under many states' laws and under the ADA.
So you would think, so I'm just trying to paraphrase what you're saying here. So you would think that by posting on LinkedIn something that was very clear and very clearly distressed and suicidal, that is notification to a company. And so the company does bear some responsibility at that point, or they don't.
As long as you can prove that the company discriminated against you because you have a disability, under the ADA, that's illegal. And
Right.
so you don't have to go to your employer and say, I have depression, and then, like, there's not a formal requirement that you give some kind of formal notice. It's like, did they know or have reason to know that you have a mental
Okay.
illness? So
Yeah.
I believe that posting, like saying I'm having a mental breakdown, it puts the company on notice that you have a mental illness. And so if they then fire you because of that, it looks like they've fired you because you have a disability.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. And so another question came in from Matthew, and it says, if a person has a problem with slight lateness to work when they're having a bipolar episode because the meds are making them sleepy, is it possible to have this excused?
What I would do, I mean, yeah, that's very understandable, is I would use the reasonable accommodations. And the things that people with mental health conditions can do are get modified work schedules, ask for part-time work schedules, ask to work remotely. These are things that courts have considered to be reasonable depending on the circumstances and depending on the job. But absolutely, if you need to ask your employer, hey, like, sometimes I'll need to come in late, or I'm starting a new medication this week and I may be late some days. I think that that's certainly something an employer should consider, and that an employer should allow and accommodate. Now, if it's something that happens and you didn't know was going to happen, like you started the meds and then you showed up late for a week because of them,
Right.
I would definitely make sure to disclose to someone either in HR or to your supervisor that the reason you showed up late is that you have a disability and you were starting new medication for that disability. And I think that should protect you from any kind of retaliatory action. Not to mention, it makes you look more credible because you don't want them to think you're just flaky.
Yes. Yes. Okay. So that's great. So you think that basically being late, while someone could look at it, as you said, as being flaky or a behavioral issue, you can actually sort of look at it like a reasonable accommodation, saying, look, I need this accommodation where I'm going to be late sometimes because I'm trying to get a handle on a disability and a medical issue. So it's like a reframing of the same thing.
Yes, I think you would need to put more specifics around it. Again, it completely depends on the company, it depends on the nature of your work, it depends on the severity of your disability. So none of this is like set in stone, but my
Right.
initial thoughts when you say that are like, for me, I've had to request modified work schedules because sometimes I have medical appointments in the morning. So I
Right.
say, can I start work at 10 or 11 one day a week, or something like that. So I think the best thing you can do is try to find some predictability starting a new medication. Maybe ask if you can come in at 11 this week instead of 9,
Right.
or noon, or ask if you can have a few days off. I mean,
Right.
preempt it and say, I'm starting a new medication. Maybe I need to take 3 days off work and use your sick days.
Right.
So I think it's probably harder to do it going back. You can't say, oh, I was late all week, but can you reasonably accommodate me because the time has already, it's already happened.
Right.
Of
Right.
course, again, hopefully your managers are just kind people. And if you say, I was super late this week because I had a bad reaction to a medication, my hope is that they would be understanding of that, as long as it didn't
Right.
become a pattern where it happens all the time. But if it is something that will happen regularly, I would request an accommodation for it.
Thank you. So thank you so much for giving us all this information. I know that we didn't get to quite everything today, but there's a lot to cover. And I want to make sure that this episode is snappy enough that people will not be too scared of the length of it. But thank you so much for giving us all that information. I do want to end it there today. I'd like to thank Julia Stephanides for sharing her own experience and hard-won knowledge with us. I know that so many of us have questions about our rights, and it's really comforting to actually have some knowledgeable information on it. So thank you.
I'm so happy to be here, so happy to share, and I love your work, Natasha. So thank you for having me.
I'd also like to thank the audience for listening. Please join me in the next couple of weeks when I'll be talking to Gary Copeland, who is the president of healthyplace.com. He is a former journalist and a successful entrepreneur. He's going to be talking to us about what it's like to hire and manage people specifically with mental illnesses, as he's been doing it for over a decade. I'll also be talking to Cara McNulty, the president of Behavioral Health and Employee Assistant Programs for Aetna. She is passionate about amplifying the voices of people with mental illness, and we're going to be talking about how improving people's mental health at work is an imperative for business success, and her own experience with postpartum anxiety. So drop by the podcast website at snapoutofitpodcast.com and join our mailing list for more information. Snap Out of It
Natasha.
recording. Yeah, go ahead.
No, please finish. I just have one
Okay.
thing to say when you're done.
Okay. Snap Out of It recordings are available on your favorite podcast platform like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And if you do find us there, we would greatly appreciate a review. If you'd like to be a guest on Snap Out of It, check out our website and fill in the guest application form. That's at snapoutofitpodcast.com. So what would you like to add?
I just wanted to add, sorry to interrupt,
That's okay.
that I have a lot of really great free resources on my Instagram at
Perfect.
legally.holistic. So at legally.holistic. I include a lot of like general health resources. It's where I kind of bring workers' rights together with health and wellness, but I do have some slides on like disability rights in the workplace, an overview of medical leave, since we didn't get to talking about the specifics of that. Reasonable accommodations, just slides that are basically reminders of what your general rights are. So follow along. It's all free right now, and I just love to spread the word about this stuff because, like we said, a lot of people just don't know, and it's really empowering to know what you're entitled to.
I will link to at legally.holistic on Instagram as part of the description of the show. So that should help.
Perfect.
So thank you so much, folks. My name is Natasha Tracy. I hope you have a great week with great mental health.
Thank you.